Hey guys, tonight we begin with the hidden world behind convent walls, where piety and chastity were preached, but not always practiced. Because while the Middle Ages left behind grand cathedrals and sacred manuscripts, they also left behind court records, confessions, and letters that reveal a far less saintly side of medieval nuns. One that includes secret lovers, hidden pregnancies, escape tunnels, and even full-blown orgies conducted under the guise of spiritual ecstasy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When a woman entered a medieval convent, she was expected to leave the world behind. Along with her dresses, jewellery, and last name, she also handed over her right to any physical affection, ever again. In theory, she became a bride of Christ. In practice, the marriage was often open to interpretation. The vow of chastity was serious business. No touching, no flirting. Definitely no midnight rendezvous in the cloister garden with Brother Thomas from down the hill. But as any good historian, or bishop with a headache, will tell you, vows are only as binding as the will to follow them. And in many convents, the will was flexible. For some nuns, the vow of chastity was treated more like a suggestion. After all, if you're locked behind stone walls for decades, surrounded only by other women and the occasional suspiciously handsome confessor, things can get blurry, very blurry. Some got creative. There were whispered arguments that affection didn't count if it wasn't intentional. Others leaned into spiritual loopholes. If Christ was your heavenly husband, then who could object to a little passion, mystical or otherwise? Especially if you wrote it down in Latin. Reports from church officials, sent to check that everything was pure and pious, often contained delicately phrased complaints like excessive familiarity between sisters, or unescorted male visitors to the orchard. Translated, someone was misbehaving, and it was probably happening near the apples. Then there were the convents that ran more like noble dormitories. Wealthy families would send off their troublesome daughters with the clear expectation that someone else would deal with their enthusiasm. Some convents tried. Others shrugged and hoped the bishop didn't visit too often. Of course, not every nun strayed. Many lived genuinely devout lives, praying, studying, and baking bread that could dent a helmet. But others? Let's just say they interpreted the rule of chastity the way people today interpret unlimited breadsticks. So yes, chastity was written in ink, sworn before God, and embroidered into the rule books. But behind those quiet walls, things were occasionally rewritten. Pregnancy, as a general rule, is difficult to explain away, even more so when you're a nun. While you could conceal a secret lover or smuggle in a wheel of contraband cheese, a growing belly was significantly harder to tuck under a habit, and even harder to explain without implicating at least one person, several sins, and occasionally a confused donkey. Medieval convents were supposed to be sanctuaries of chastity, but reality had other ideas. Church records, bishopric complaints, and truly scandalized abbesses all suggest one consistent truth. Nuns were getting pregnant. Not hypothetically, not symbolically, physically, undeniably, and inconveniently pregnant. The excuses were often creative. Some claimed demonic possession. Others cited miraculous conception, which, while technically possible in biblical precedent, was treated with skepticism when it happened 3 towns over and involved Brother Jacques, the choir director. One nun even claimed she fell on a man. Hard to argue with gravity. Once discovered, convents usually responded with panic and strategic memory loss. The pregnant nun would be sent on retreat or develop a sudden, prolonged illness requiring total seclusion. If she gave birth, the baby might be whisked away under the cover of night, either to a foundling home, a sympathetic relative, or, in the darker cases, nowhere good at all. Some infants were quietly buried on convent grounds, with headstones that read like vague apologies to God. The father? That was always the next question, and the answers varied. Priests, travelling nobles, gardeners. In one memorable trial, the accused was a wandering musician with a harp and indecent smile. No further explanation was given, or needed. Punishment was equally inconsistent. Peasant-born nuns might be excommunicated and sent away in disgrace. Noble-born sisters, on the other hand, often received stern warnings and a sabbatical. One particularly brazen abbess got caught with a lover and a child, and still managed to keep her job. Clearly, management worked differently back then. Of course, the Church insisted these were isolated incidents, rare, tragic, deeply regrettable. And yet the archival paper trail says otherwise. Parchment doesn't lie, especially when it's soaked in scandal. If there's one thing medieval convents underestimated, it was the power of stationery. Love in the cloister was a delicate operation, silent, coded, and written with the kind of flowery Latin that could either be a romantic confession or a very intense prayer. Nuns may have taken vows of silence, but their quills, far less obedient. Letters were everything. When face-to-face trysts were too risky, and meaningful glances across the chapel became unfulfilling, love found its loophole through ink and wax. Some were slipped through cracks in the cloister wall. Others were tucked into loaves of bread, or passed via suspiciously helpful novices with excellent poker faces. The contents ranged from sweet to unprintable. One nun wrote to her priest-lover that she longed to drink of his chalice of devotion. The bishop investigating the case was so unsettled, he ordered the letter burned, twice, just to be sure. These secret romances weren't always fleeting flings either. Some lasted years. One nun in France maintained a correspondence with a young nobleman for over a decade, outliving 2 abbesses and at least 3 failed attempts to catch her. She finally got caught after quoting Ovid a little too accurately in the convent's choir book. Naturally, the Church took a dim view of this literary lust. When letters were discovered, punishments followed: excommunication, penance, confinement to solitary prayer, or worse, a forced public reading of the letters before the entire convent, which may have been more humiliating than divine judgment. And the lovers? If they were men of the cloth, they were usually reassigned to a colder, less romantic post. If they were laymen, well, one was once flogged, fined, and ordered to never again speak to women of the cloth or otherwise. His reply: "Can I still write?" Even more embarrassing were the cases where love letters got intercepted and passed around like medieval gossip columns. Imagine spending hours composing your deepest, holiest affections, only for them to be read aloud by a giggling novice over mead and cheese. Still, the ink kept flowing, because when walls were high and eyes were watching, love adapted, with metaphor, innuendo, and very determined handwriting. In theory, a convent was a fortress of purity. In reality, it was more like a boarding school with walls, and in some cases, a surprising number of escape routes. Medieval nuns weren't just spiritually restless, some were physically inventive. And if you're imagining dainty women gently tiptoeing through a rose garden gate, you'd be wrong. Some of these escape attempts involved scaling walls with bedsheets, bribing guards, crawling through underground drains, and, in one case, dressing as a monk and walking out the front door like it was a normal Tuesday. The motivations varied. Some fled to reunite with lovers. Others simply hated monastic life. A few wanted to return home after realizing that eternal silence meant exactly that, even during meals. Perhaps the most legendary of all escapees was Sister Benedetta of Verona. Sent to the convent at age 14, she made 3 separate attempts to flee. On the 3rd try, she disguised herself as a novice from a neighbouring abbey, forged travel papers, and escaped on a cart of vegetables. She reportedly made it halfway to Venice before being caught, not because of her disguise, but because she kept trying to flirt with the guard. Some escapes were more dramatic. In Saxony, a group of nuns staged a collective breakout after their abbess banned music. They overpowered the gatekeeper with a loaf of stale bread and vanished into the woods. Church authorities later described them as disoriented and unrepentant, which frankly sounds like the tagline for an excellent medieval drama. When caught, escaped nuns were usually hauled back and subjected to some delightful combination of public shame, fasting, and being locked in a cold stone room with nothing but a crucifix and disappointment. Repeat offenders, and there were many, might be transferred to stricter convents, where the food was worse and the walls were higher. But for some, even that wasn't enough to extinguish the flame of rebellion. A few nuns escaped, married their lovers, and lived out their days pretending they'd never seen a cloister, let alone lived in one. Because sometimes the habit just didn't fit, and the window was open. Every scandal has its icon, and in the annals of convent impropriety, Sister Agnes of Würzburg deserves her own stained-glass window, preferably one that blushes. Agnes was, by all accounts, an intelligent and charming nun with a notable gift for music, prayer, and hosting a night in her cell for over a year. Yes, a night. A real one. Armour, sword, probably some tragic backstory. His name has been lost to history, which is suspicious in itself. But what we do know is that he was reportedly recovering from wounds sustained in battle. Where exactly this battle took place is unclear. It may have been in a field, a tavern, or perhaps the convent courtyard after he tripped trying to sneak in. According to the bishop's records, the night was discovered after a novice reported strange clanking noises coming from Agnes's cell. Upon investigation, church officials found the man hiding behind a tapestry, eating preserved figs and humming hymns to pass the time. His only defence. Sister Agnes is a healer, of both body and soul. Agnes, to her credit, did not deny the affair. In fact, she seemed genuinely annoyed to be interrupted. She stated that she was caring for the wounded, and that compassion is a holy virtue, which is true, though rarely invoked to justify cohabitation with a chain-mailed boyfriend. The scandal rocked the convent, not just because of the affair, but because of the duration. A few weeks, even a secret rendezvous, forgivable. But 12 months, during which the knight was seen at least twice wearing a borrowed monk's robe and helping with garden chores. That took planning and commitment. The fallout was swift and theatrical. Agnes was stripped of her position, publicly shamed, and reassigned to a stricter order. The knight? Fined and exiled, though one record dryly notes that he did not seem regretful, which is probably the most medieval way of saying he smirked the whole time. As for Agnes, she later wrote letters protesting the church's hypocrisy, quoting scripture and medical texts in her defence. One line stood out: "Had I let him die, I'd be a sinner still." Not all scandals in medieval convents involved sneaking knights or secret letters. Some were louder, moaned, wept, and trembled in full public view, all while claiming to be in contact with the divine. Enter the mystic nun. In the Middle Ages, certain nuns were known for having ecstatic religious visions. These weren't your average quiet moments of reflection. No, these were full-bodied, eyes rolled back, trembling on the floor spiritual encounters. And while some church officials called them holy, others had questions. Mostly, why did these visions sound so enthusiastic? Take Sister Beatrix, a nun from the Low Countries, who claimed Christ came to her nightly. Not metaphorically, physically. Her writings described embraces of divine warmth and spiritual union beyond the veil of flesh. At one point she declared herself wedded to the Lamb, which might sound innocent until you read the parts where she compared his presence to fire that spread within and without. Subtle. Then there's Hadovich of Antwerp, a 13th century mystic whose poetry reads like the medieval version of a steamy romance novel, if that novel were set entirely inside a chapel. She wrote of consuming love and being pierced by divine light. Some of her lines were so vivid that later church scholars tried to edit them into more appropriate metaphors. The original versions, however, are preserved, and eyebrow-raising. To be fair, not every nun faked their ecstasy. Many were sincere. Medieval theology encouraged intense emotional relationships with Christ, sometimes verging into language that modern readers might file under PG-13. But sincerity doesn't cancel out the fact that these visions caused serious stirrings, both spiritual and otherwise. Not everyone was impressed. Some bishops accused these women of attention-seeking. Others worried about the influence such visions had on younger, more impressionable nuns. One particularly sceptical archbishop referred to them as hysteria masquerading as holiness. He was later reassigned, possibly for saying what everyone else was thinking. Still, some mystic nuns became celebrities. Their visions were recorded, copied, and venerated, which, in medieval terms, meant they got away with writing divine fan fiction and calling it theology. If there's one thing medieval monasteries were known for, it's restraint, of the body, of the tongue, and especially of the stomach. Fasting was seen as holy. Hunger was a virtue. Appetite? A temptation best left in the garden with the snake. But inside some convents, fasting was more of a daytime suggestion. Because when the bells stopped ringing and the abbess retired to her chamber, a different kind of ritual began. The forbidden feast. Convents were supposed to keep a strict diet. Porridge, bread, the occasional fish, and an existential crisis for dessert. Meat, rich cheeses, sweets, and wine were generally banned, especially during Lent or any of the dozens of fasting days that made up roughly half the year. But let's be honest, no one can eat boiled cabbage forever without plotting something. And plot they did. Some nuns developed covert culinary networks. Friendly merchants would deliver salted meats for medicinal purposes. Wine was relabeled as consecrated vinegar. Honey cakes were just there for visitors who, mysteriously, never arrived. One surviving convent inventory included 2 ducks, 1 whole ham, a jug of cherry wine, and 3 wheels of cheese. It was catalogued under liturgical supplies. You can draw your own conclusions. Midnight feasts became a thing. Picture this: a candle-lit room deep in the convent, filled with giggling nuns, whispering psalms between bites of roasted goose. One novice reportedly burned her hand sneaking hot pastries out of the oven and tried to claim it was a punishment from the Holy Spirit. No one bought it, but the pastries were apparently excellent. Sometimes these feasts became social affairs, with visiting men, merchants, priests, or in some cases, men who had no official reason to be in a convent after dark. One abbey in Burgundy was found to be hosting unapproved gatherings, which turned out to be regular Saturday night banquets, complete with dancing, gambling, and what the bishop diplomatically described as inappropriate merriment. Of course, not every nun partook. Many were genuinely devout and horrified by such indulgence, but others, let's just say their idea of fasting was eating quickly before someone catches us. Few things unnerved medieval church authorities more than a nun with a bump. Unless, of course, that bump turned into a baby, and then into a shallow grave beneath the convent pantry. One of the most chilling scandals emerged from a 14th century French convent, where rumours began to swirl of strange noises coming from the cellar. It wasn't rats. It wasn't bad plumbing. It was, as one horrified novice described, something crying that had no right to be there. When church investigators arrived, they expected the usual: a wine stash, some forbidden cheese, maybe a love letter or two. What they found was a hastily dug patch of disturbed earth beneath a barrel of pickled cabbage. Underneath, the body of a newborn child, wrapped in what was clearly a torn wimple, the headdress worn by the sisters. The implication was not subtle. The resulting investigation was as delicate as a plague cart. The mother was never officially named, though several nuns were relocated shortly afterward. a common euphemism for "please disappear quietly before this becomes a trial." The abbess, when questioned, claimed ignorance. "I was not informed of any childbirth," she stated, while standing next to a suspiciously well-used wash basin. She added that any woman who gave birth in the convent had clearly entered already pregnant, which is one of the oldest and least effective explanations in the scandal playbook. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across Europe, hidden pregnancies occasionally resulted in tragic ends. Babies were left at the doors of monasteries. Some were smuggled out to sympathetic families. A few, heartbreakingly, didn't survive long enough for either. The church responded with its usual cocktail of outrage and selective amnesia. Punishments ranged from public penance to quiet transfers. But as long as the walls stayed high and the letters stayed hidden, many such stories were buried, literally and figuratively. Still, every time a cellar was repaved or a pantry reorganized, there was the faint possibility of another discovery. A tiny scandal, wrapped in linen and silence. If there's a scale of things nuns were not supposed to do, opening a brothel lands somewhere between heresy and throwing a bishop out a window. But in 15th century Bologna, one former nun named Sister Clara decided she'd had enough of vows, veils, and virtue. So she left the convent and opened a highly successful brothel in her old convent building, with the habits still in use, because subtlety was apparently not part of the business plan. Clara hadn't exactly been cloister material to begin with. Church records describe her as willful and frequently absent from vespers. Translated, she didn't show up for prayer and possibly had plans involving wine and someone named Marco. Her decision to leave the convent wasn't particularly dramatic. She simply walked out and never returned. The real drama began later, when passers-by noticed the convent had suddenly become very popular with men who had no known interest in theology. According to a local magistrate, Clara employed women, some ex-nuns, others just creatively unemployed, and ran the establishment with military efficiency. Clients reportedly paid extra for costumes. Some men requested the full confession experience, which raises theological questions no one was prepared to answer. When word reached the church, panic ensued. Not because prostitution was rare, it wasn't, but because this particular brothel had the nerve to look like a convent and function better than most monasteries. The optics were terrible. Clara, when summoned to explain herself, simply shrugged and said, "At least no one here pretends to be chaste." She was excommunicated. Then re-excommunicated, just to be sure. The building was seized, the operation dismantled, and Clara was, allegedly, sent to a nunnery far from Bologna, which seems like an odd choice, but perhaps poetic justice. Yet her legacy lingered. For years afterward, the site was colloquially known as the Cloister of Delight. It even appeared in bawdy plays and songs. And though the church tried to erase her memory, Clara became something of a folk legend, the nun who skipped salvation and went into hospitality. Confession, the spiritual reset button of medieval Catholicism. For a nun, it was supposed to be a solemn ritual of self-examination, humility, and penitence. You knelt. You whispered your transgressions. The priest offered absolution. You left lighter, in theory. But in practice? Confession occasionally led to more sins than it forgave. Enter the confessor scandal, a genre of misbehaviour so common it nearly became cliché. The setup was simple. One priest, many nuns, and an enclosed space designed specifically for private conversation about temptation. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot, it turns out. Some confessors took their spiritual duties seriously. Others took ministering to the soul as an open invitation to explore the rest of the nun's emotional terrain, especially if she was young, anxious, or from a wealthy family whose influence might protect them both. Boundaries were porous, the curtains were thick, and ecclesiastical supervision was mostly theoretical. In one infamous case, Father Anselm of Tours heard the confessions of 30 nuns and somehow managed to develop special spiritual intimacy with 10 of them. The abbess began to suspect something when Sister Magdalene emerged from confession, giggling and smelling faintly of clove wine. Reports of impropriety trickled in across Europe. Some confessors were caught meeting nuns at odd hours. Others received love letters disguised as theological questions. One was discovered with his hand on a novice's knee, claiming he was checking her for signs of demonic possession. Creative, at least. The Church's response? Delicate silence, followed by reassignment. A confessor accused of misconduct was usually sent to another diocese to reflect, which in medieval terms meant, do it somewhere else and try not to get caught this time. Meanwhile, the nuns were left in awkward positions. Some were shamed. Others were blamed entirely, accused of seducing the priest with feminine charm, which, in many cases, meant existing while under 30. A few refused to confess again at all, choosing silence over sanctity. Of course, not every confession turned scandalous. But the setup, male authority, female submission, secret conversations, was practically an invitation to abuse, especially when wrapped in incense and Latin. Not all convent mischief involved flesh and desire. Some of it came in the form of suspiciously helpful nuns, with access to plants that could either heal a headache or terminate a pregnancy. Nearly every convent had a herb garden. It was part of daily monastic life. Nuns made balms, tinctures, and herbal remedies for ailments ranging from stomach aches to demonic possession, though success with the latter was mixed. But in some communities, these humble healers turned into convent chemists, and the line between medicine and mischief began to blur. They were known as the apothecary sisters, and they understood their plants well. Too well, in some cases. Many were trained in the use of abortifacients, herbs like pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, which were used discreetly to restore irregular cycles. Of course, the official explanation was always vague. The potion was for a nervous condition or a stubborn humoral imbalance. But everyone knew what it meant when a nun visited the herbarium after whispering with a red face and a shaky voice. Some convents became known, quietly, as safe places for women with delicate problems. A noblewoman with an inconvenient pregnancy might suddenly decide to pursue spiritual retreat, and emerge 2 months later looking oddly slimmer and far more devout. Sister Hildegard of Trier was particularly famous, described in records as an herbalist of great discretion. According to one very nervous male witness, her concoctions could calm a restless body, silence an inconvenient cough, or undo what the flesh hath done. You had to admire the poetic phrasing. Of course, the Church did not officially approve. But as long as things stayed quiet, and the patients left looking grateful rather than pregnant, few bishops asked questions. It was easier to assume the sisters were simply very good at teas. That said, there were darker rumours. Stories of potions slipped into wine, or love spells crafted with hair and bone. Most were likely exaggerated. But some convents did face inquiries for harbouring witch-like tendencies, which in 15th century Europe was not the sort of review you wanted from your local inquisitor. For most medieval nuns, public exposure was a spiritual hazard. But for some, it became a legal necessity, especially when their private transgressions turned into public litigation. Across Europe, convents occasionally found themselves dragged into secular courts. The causes varied. Inheritance disputes, dowry claims, property feuds, and, more awkwardly, cases involving illicit affairs, pregnancies, and behaviour that was not befitting a bride of Christ. That last phrase appeared often. It was medieval legal code for someone's been up to something. One particularly spectacular case came from Florence, where a nun named Sister Constanza sued a priest for breach of promise. She alleged that he seduced her in the confessional, promised to leave the priesthood, and then, tragically, didn't. She provided letters, witnesses, a very pointed poem. The court was so flustered, it delayed judgment for 3 years, hoping everyone involved would die or take vows of silence. Another case in Cologne saw an abbess accused of misusing convent funds. to buy luxury linens, spiced wine, and gifts for visitors. The visitors, it turned out, were male, under 30, and unusually well-groomed for pilgrims. The trial records read like an expense report for a high-end inn. The abbess claimed the items were for spiritual hospitality. The court disagreed. Sometimes the church tried to keep things in-house. Canon law was supposed to handle naughty nuns. But when crimes spilled over into civil territory, like theft, child abandonment, or contractual fraud, secular judges had to step in. And they were often unprepared for veiled women quoting scripture while denying everything with holy indignation. One nun in Burgundy was charged with attacking another nun over a man. During questioning, she claimed she had been possessed by jealousy and possibly by the devil. A 2-for-1 defence that bought her reduced penance and a relocation. These courtroom dramas were usually quieted as quickly as possible. The church didn't enjoy broadcasting its internal soap operas, but word always got out. Local taverns would buzz with phrases like, "Did you hear about the nun with the wine bill?" Or, "She brought her dowry and her boyfriend to court." In a world where few could read and fewer could fact-check, relics were the medieval version of verified badges. And some convents collected them with all the restraint of a modern teenager at a clearance sale. Holy bones, scraps of cloth, drops of saintly blood, these items drew pilgrims, donations, and prestige. For many nuns, relics were sacred connections to heaven. For others, they were more like revenue streams. Take Abbess Euphemia of Thuringia, who claimed her convent housed a piece of Mary Magdalene's hairbrush. Not a splinter of the true cross, not a veil fragment, but a grooming tool from the most misunderstood woman in Scripture. Euphemia described it as heaven-scented and encouraged visiting pilgrims to kneel before it and leave coins. The bishop, on inspection, discovered it was almost certainly a comb from a local merchant and smelled faintly of rosemary and goat. Then there's the convent in Bruges that proudly displayed the fingernail of St. Apollonia, patron saint of toothaches. When scholars examined it, they found it was, in fact, a sliver of cow horn. The abbess insisted the miracle came not from the relic itself, but from faith in its idea, a bold theological pivot to say the least. Some nuns became quite creative. One claimed to have a handkerchief used by the Virgin Mary, still damp with tears, centuries later. Another swore she owned a thorn from the crown of thorns, despite living in a convent located hundreds of miles from any known trade route. When asked how she acquired it, she simply smiled and said, "The Lord provides." To be fair, not all these relics were fakes. Some were genuinely ancient, mysterious, and possibly holy. But the sheer volume of relics claimed by convents, including 6 different skulls of John the Baptist and 3 navels of Christ, suggests that enthusiasm occasionally outpaced accuracy. Still, relics worked. Pilgrims came, coins clinked, and convents that couldn't attract visitors with sermons found that bones, real or not, were excellent marketing. Behind the convent walls, it wasn't all rosaries and repentance. Some nuns were running soft power empires, conducting correspondence, managing land, and outmanoeuvring bishops, all while pretending to care deeply about embroidery. These weren't your average sisters. They were abbesses, often from noble families, and they understood something crucial about medieval life. Influence wasn't sinful, if you called it stewardship. Take Abbess Matilda of Essen, who effectively ran her abbey like a duchy. She negotiated land deals, hosted royal guests, and once publicly corrected a visiting count's Latin. She was revered as pious and terrifying, a combination that allowed her to get things done while technically never leaving the cloister. Many convents controlled vast estates. The church may have frowned on women wielding authority, but it had no problem accepting their taxes. That left abbesses and senior nuns in charge of finances, agriculture, and disputes with tenant farmers. And like any good landowner, they sometimes bribed local officials, forged a deed or two, and encouraged favourable tithes through blessings. One convent in Normandy famously negotiated its own treaty with a rival monastery after a dispute over fishing rights turned into a full-blown holy turf war. The abbess at the time, Sister Julienne, wrote a peace letter described by scholars as unusually sharp for a woman sworn to humility. Translation: she absolutely roasted the abbot in flawless Latin. Then there was the political matchmaking. Noble families frequently installed their daughters in convents, not always for piety, but for strategic placement. A nun from the right lineage could serve as a family agent, passing along information, lobbying quietly, or even delaying papal decisions with conveniently lost letters. Some convents had spies, some had lawyers. One German abbey reportedly employed a scribe who also knew fencing, which suggests their copy-editing process was especially intense. Of course, the church noticed, and occasionally tried to crack down, but as long as the sisters remained outwardly devout, there was little the hierarchy could do. You can't excommunicate someone for being too competent, even if they're clearly running the place like a velvet-gloved mafia. By the late Middle Ages, some convents had evolved into something resembling self-contained cities, complete with economies, hierarchies, gossip, secrets, and, yes, the occasional underground baby swap. Not all scandal wore a sultry smile or left behind a pile of love letters. Some wore silence. Not the holy kind, but the strategic kind. The kind of silence that kept reputations intact, that covered up the crying, the blood, the sudden illness. The nun who mysteriously vanished after taking ill, and whose cell was given to a new novice by morning. Because sometimes scandal wasn't loud, it was procedural. Take the case of Abbess Theodora, who ruled her convent like a medieval CEO. She managed lands, hosted dukes, and held prayer vigils so elaborate they required seating charts. When 3 of her novices turned up pregnant over the span of 1 year, she insisted it was the result of spiritual temptation and ordered stricter fasting for everyone but herself. When local clerics raised questions, she accused them of envy and threatened to withhold intercessory prayer for their souls. A chilling flex, even for the 14th century. Other convents simply leaned into their notoriety. The Abbey of St. Lucilla, outside Milan, quietly gained a reputation as a refuge for reformed women, a vague term that meant former courtesans who now spend 20% of their day in prayer and 80% in expensive robes. They hosted musical recitals, charged admission for feast day processions, and kept peacocks, actual live peacocks, in the garden. The bishop called them a minor concern. Rome called them profitable. In England, one nun was so successful at forging indulgences that her scrolls made it all the way to York Cathedral, where they were blessed by a bishop before anyone realised they were printed using ink mixed with berry wine. Even the devout weren't immune to strange practices. One mystic nun claimed she had spiritual visions only when fasting and dancing at the same time. Her superior eventually banned both, prompting her to invent holy spinning. Visitors thought she was possessed. She insisted she was simply expressing divine joy, at 30 revolutions per minute, because beneath the incense and scripture was always something else. Raw, stubborn life, clawing its way through the cracks in the marble. Before he was the world's most legendary barrel-dwelling philosopher, Diogenes was just the son of a banker in the Greek city of Sinope. That's right. The man who would later scoff at gold and spit on wealth was literally born into money. And, well, that didn't last long. Diogenes' life took a turn when he and his father Hicesius were implicated in a rather creative crime, defacing the local currency. Not metaphorically. They were accused of literally tampering with the coins, possibly shaving them down or forging them. It's still debated whether Diogenes knew exactly what he was doing, or if he was just helping Dad with the family business. But one thing's clear. The local authorities were not amused, and so the future cynic was promptly exiled. Now, for most people, being exiled from their hometown would be a tragedy. For Diogenes, it was a career move. He fled to Athens, the philosophical epicenter of the Greek world. and decided that instead of crawling back into respectable society, he would dismantle it, bit by bit, with sarcasm, a sharp tongue, and complete disregard for pants. Athens, at the time, was full of prestigious thinkers and polished sophists. Plato, Aristotle, the whole gang. Diogenes, penniless and technically homeless, didn't care. While others debated metaphysics in linen robes, he rolled into town with a dog-like grin and a mission: expose every shred of hypocrisy he could sniff out. And yes, dog-like isn't a metaphor. He embraced it. In fact, he proudly identified with the word kynikos, meaning dog-like in Greek, which is where we get the word cynic, barking at corruption, biting at convention, licking truth raw and unfiltered. His first order of business? Ditching all societal pretense. He renounced possessions, mocked manners, and slept in a giant ceramic jar, often mistakenly called a barrel, like a philosophical raccoon. It was his ultimate statement: if society was a facade, he was going to live outside of it. Literally. This wasn't just rebellion for rebellion's sake. Diogenes believed that virtue came from living in accordance with nature, and nature didn't need money, reputation, or 10-room villas. It just needed honesty, and maybe a sturdy jar. If Athens was the heart of philosophical prestige, then Plato was its golden child, polished, revered, and entirely too serious for Diogenes' taste. While Plato was categorizing virtues and defining abstract ideals, Diogenes was, well, peeing on them, literally and figuratively. One of the most famous anecdotes involves Plato attempting to define a human being as a featherless biped. He thought it was a clever summary of our species. Diogenes, always ready to weaponize mockery, plucked a chicken and brought it into the academy, loudly declaring, "Behold, Plato's human." The joke landed so hard that Plato was forced to revise the definition by adding, "with broad, flat nails." Score 1 for the man in the jar. But Diogenes wasn't just trolling for attention. He believed that philosophers like Plato had become too wrapped up in abstract nonsense, forgetting to live with integrity. To Diogenes, virtue wasn't something to be debated, it was something to be lived. And if that meant heckling the intellectual elite while munching onions and looking homeless, so be it. He made a habit of disrupting Plato's lectures, walking through the crowds with a lantern in broad daylight, muttering that he was looking for an honest man. The crowd laughed, nervously, because deep down they knew he was right. Athens, for all its democratic ideals and marble buildings, had become a place of polite lies and philosophical performance. Diogenes tore through it with blunt honesty. Plato reportedly called Diogenes Socrates gone mad. And that wasn't entirely wrong. Like Socrates, Diogenes asked uncomfortable questions and refused to play by societal rules. But unlike Socrates, Diogenes didn't want a dialogue. He wanted a spectacle. And he was more than happy to play the clown if it meant revealing hypocrisy. He made the simple life look outrageous. He begged without shame, ate whatever scraps he could find, relieved himself wherever he pleased, often to the horror of onlookers. But each action, however crude, was a philosophical statement. Why should he feel shame for natural functions when others felt no shame for lying, cheating, and hoarding wealth? Where Plato built ideal worlds, Diogenes smashed the illusions of this one. And if you asked him, that made him the real philosopher, even if he did smell a bit like old olives and existential dread. By now, Diogenes had become a full-time philosophical menace. He had no permanent address, unless you count the massive ceramic jar he slept in, tucked away in the marketplace like some kind of sentient street art installation. He owned almost nothing, just a cloak, a stick, and a cup, until he saw a boy drinking water from his hands and promptly threw the cup away. "A child has beaten me in plainness of living," he said. That was the thing about Diogenes. He didn't just talk about simplicity. He outsimplified everyone. He wasn't pretending to reject wealth while secretly hoarding silver under his mattress. No, He quite literally lived off scraps, bathed in rainwater, and slept with the dogs. In fact, he often called himself a dog, not as self-insult, but as a badge of honour. Dogs live naturally, without shame, pretense, or obsession with status. And that's exactly how Diogenes wanted to live, bark included. Then there was the lamp, or lantern depending on the translation, which he famously carried during the day. "What are you doing?" people would ask. "Looking for an honest man," he'd grumble. Of course, the subtext was clear. He wasn't finding one. He wasn't even hopeful. The joke was the point, a slap in the face to everyone who thought themselves virtuous while living lives dripping in compromise. His daily life became performance art, and every gesture was a lesson. When he was once caught masturbating in public, he reportedly quipped, "If only it were as easy to relieve hunger by rubbing my stomach." Crude, absolutely. But for Diogenes, natural acts weren't shameful. Hypocrisy was. And let's be clear, Diogenes wasn't poor because he had to be. He had offers of shelter, food, even patronage from wealthy admirers. He turned them down like someone dodging a pyramid scheme. For him, accepting charity meant chaining yourself to obligation, and Diogenes wouldn't be leashed. Not by money, not by decorum, and definitely not by society's awkward coughs when he did something uncivilized in public. He wasn't living on the fringe of society. He had planted himself there like a thorn, sharp, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. If everyone else was busy polishing their masks, Diogenes was proudly showing his dirt. And in a world full of roles and rituals, that was the most radical act of all. One of the most iconic encounters in ancient philosophy, and possibly in all of history, happened between the dirtiest man in Athens and the most powerful man on earth. Enter Alexander the Great, a young conqueror with the ego of a god and the army to back it up. After hearing stories about Diogenes, Alexander was intrigued. Here was a man who had nothing, wanted nothing, feared nothing, and yet commanded attention across the Greek world. Naturally, Alexander had to meet him. He found Diogenes lounging in his jar, sunbathing like a stray cat that just happened to be fluent in moral philosophy. The king of Macedon approached and asked the famous question, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes, without even sitting up, replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." Meek drop. Alexander's entourage was horrified. This man had just dismissed the ruler of most of the known world like an annoying street vendor. But Alexander, he was impressed. According to legend, he turned to his men and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." It's the kind of statement history professors love to quote, and YouTube comment sections love to misattribute. But regardless of its historical accuracy, the moment captures the essence of Diogenes. In a world obsessed with power, he was untouchable because he wanted absolutely nothing. He had no palace, no army, no reputation to protect. You can't bribe a man who sleeps in a jar. You can't blackmail a man who begs for food. And you definitely can't impress a man who finds luxury laughable. What Diogenes taught Alexander, and the world, was that true power comes from needing nothing and fearing no one. That was Diogenes' ultimate rebellion, not shouting on the streets, not urinating on social customs, but stripping life down to its barest essentials and daring anyone to call him poor. In a single sentence, he reduced one of history's greatest conquerors to a shadow blocking the sun. And unlike most philosophers, Diogenes didn't just preach this freedom. He lived it so fully, even emperors felt small in his presence. Now imagine trying to impress your friends after that. Good luck. By now, Diogenes wasn't just a local eccentric. He was the embodiment of a new way of thinking. Cynicism. And not the watered-down version we throw around today when someone's being grumpy about politics. No, the original cynicism was feral, raw, and had fleas. Diogenes believed that society had become rotten because it was built on lies. Lies about happiness, virtue, success. People spent their lives chasing wealth, climbing social ladders, and stuffing their heads with abstract nonsense. Diogenes took one look at all that and said, "No thanks. I'd rather sleep in a pot and eat scraps." At its core, cynicism was about living in harmony with nature. That meant shedding all artificial needs, luxury, fame, political ambition, and returning to a life of simplicity and self-sufficiency. If nature didn't hand you a golden goblet, then maybe you didn't need one. And if nature gave you a stomach, then yes, begging for bread or stealing an onion was more honest than flattering a politician. His philosophy was also deeply confrontational. Diogenes didn't hide his beliefs in essays or temple scrolls. He lived them loudly. He mocked, barked, and even physically interrupted people's lives to force them to see their own contradictions. If someone preached virtue but lived lavishly, Diogenes would follow them around like a philosophical heckler, exposing the rot underneath the silk. To Diogenes, actions mattered far more than ideas. In fact, he once said, "Other dogs bite their enemies. I bite my friends to save them," because nothing said friendship like a good, metaphorical gnaw on the ankle of your delusions. He was especially brutal toward hypocrisy, especially among philosophers. If a scholar claimed that poverty was noble while living in comfort, Diogenes would hold up a mirror, metaphorically or otherwise. He once saw a lavish temple being built and declared, "The gods must have gone blind if they need such a grand house." In a world obsessed with image, Diogenes was image's natural predator. Where others cloaked their ambitions in rhetoric, he stripped everything down, literally and figuratively. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to wake people up. And if that meant barking like a dog or relieving himself on public statues, well, so be it. Truth, after all, wasn't always polite. Diogenes wasn't just a philosopher. He was Athens' walking conscience, a filthy, loud, extremely inconvenient one. Depending on whom you asked, he was either a lunatic with bowel control issues or the only sane man in a city full of liars. Maybe both. He made a career out of offending people. Once, during a feast, he walked barefoot across the banquet hall's expensive carpet, wiping off the mud from his feet and muttering, "Thus I trample on the pride of Plato." Not exactly RSVP behaviour. But for Diogenes, this was more than rudeness. It was protest against vanity, excess, and all the hollow rituals people wrapped around themselves to feel important. He challenged everyone. When he saw a wealthy man donating to the poor just to be admired, Diogenes muttered, "That's not charity, that's investment." Another time, he saw a man getting angry at being slapped and said, "You shouldn't be upset. It was just flesh striking flesh." This wasn't just philosophy, it was psychological judo. But the real genius of Diogenes wasn't just in what he said, it was how he lived. His daily existence was a critique of everything people took for granted. He turned the world upside down and held it there, waiting to see what coins fell out. Naturally, not everyone appreciated the free lessons. He was ridiculed, attacked, and even arrested, though trying to arrest a man with no possessions and no shame was like trying to confiscate smoke. In one city, after being captured and sold as a slave, yes, really, he calmly told the auctioneer, "Sell me to a man who needs a master." Let that sink in. He ended up with a Corinthian man named Xeniades, who didn't just buy Diogenes. He took him home and let him run the household, educate the children, and essentially become a sarcastic live-in life coach. Somehow, Diogenes turned slavery into a lecture series. Whether insulting kings or mentoring children, Diogenes stayed painfully consistent. He mocked all power structures, even ones he accidentally became part of. If someone ever did try to praise him too much, he'd remind them that he was just a dog chasing truth, and occasionally peeing on golden statues. He was society's permanent splinter. The more you tried to ignore him, the deeper he lodged into your conscience. To say Diogenes had strong opinions about social conventions would be like saying the sun is a bit warm. He didn't just reject polite customs. He launched a one-man war against them with the ferocity of a barefoot prophet and the hygiene of a disobedient raccoon. Bathing? Overrated? Dining etiquette? Pointless. Shame. a tool used by cowards and hypocrites to hide behind marble columns. Diogenes believed that most societal norms weren't there to help people. They existed to control them, to shame them into conformity, and to separate the powerful from the poor. So naturally, he decided to live in a way that defied every single one of them. He often walked around barefoot through broken streets, even in the winter. When asked why he didn't wear shoes like a normal person, he replied, "If I were in need of shoes, I'd be more distressed about my life than my feet." Diogenes also had a knack for performing embarrassing bodily functions in public, and not out of ignorance. He knew exactly what he was doing. These acts weren't random. They were statements. He believed that if something was natural and necessary, it shouldn't be a source of shame. In other words, if you're going to scold me for burping, but not for cheating your neighbour, your moral compass is broken. Even begging became a form of resistance. While most beggars tried to appeal to pity or social obligation, Diogenes treated it as a spiritual test, for himself and the person being asked. If they gave, fine. If not, that was fine too. Either way, he stayed honest, and hungry. But Diogenes wasn't just rebelling for rebellion's sake. His whole existence was an ongoing experiment to see how little a person needed to live well. Not just survive, live well, with dignity, with freedom, with a sense of humour sharp enough to slice through the pomp of politicians and the polished language of philosophers. He exposed the absurdity of conventions by ignoring them entirely, and the more people insisted he behave normally, the more he doubled down, proving that many so-called civilized behaviours were really just rituals we performed to make ourselves feel superior. In a world that obsessed over masks, Diogenes was barefaced, and probably barefoot, laughing in the sun, asking us why we weren't. Diogenes, of course, didn't leave behind memoirs, marble busts, or temples in his honour. He wouldn't have wanted them. In fact, if someone had tried to build him a statue, he probably would have spat on it. His legacy lives not in what he created, but in what he destroyed. Illusions, pretensions, and egos. As for his death, like everything else about Diogenes, it's surrounded by stories that are somewhere between tragic, ridiculous, and profoundly fitting. Some say he died from holding his breath out of boredom with life. Others claim he succumbed to an infected dog bite, irony not lost on anyone familiar with his nickname. And then there's the version where he simply lay down, said nothing, and didn't get back up. No grand last words, no dramatic curtain close, just the world's loudest cynic slipping away silently, as if even death didn't impress him. When asked how he wanted to be buried, Diogenes reportedly replied, "Throw me outside the city wall and let the beasts have me." Shocked, someone asked if he was worried about animals tearing him apart. Diogenes answered, "Not if you give me a stick to chase them away." "But you won't be able to use it," the man pointed out. "Then why should I care what happens to me when I'm dead?" Diogenes. 1. Mortality. 0. In the centuries after his death, Diogenes' teachings didn't disappear. They spread like wildfire among those who were tired of hypocrisy. His brand of cynicism inspired a whole school of thought, influencing later Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who borrowed the idea of self-sufficiency and virtue untainted by wealth or reputation. Even today, in an age obsessed with filters, followers, and fortune, Diogenes still feels oddly relevant. He's a reminder that true freedom isn't found in owning more, it's in needing less. That dignity doesn't come from titles, but from living in line with your values, even if those values include yelling at statues and living in a barrel. He may have died penniless, homeless, and barefoot, but Diogenes left behind something far more durable than gold. The uncomfortable truth. The kind that sticks in your brain like a splinter and dares you to laugh at yourself. Or at least question why you're not carrying a lantern. You'd think a man who barked at citizens, slept in a jar, and publicly scolded Plato would be a forgotten footnote in philosophy. And yet Diogenes has become a symbol, not of madness, but of radical honesty in a world built on illusion. The fact that we still talk about him over 2,000 years later says something. It says that deep down, people are still hungry for truth, even if it smells like onions and lives in a barrel. Diogenes matters today because his life was a provocation. He dared to ask, what happens when you stop playing along? What if you stop chasing wealth, reputation, even comfort, and just live with what you need? Strip away all the performance, the polite lies, the curated identities. What's left? According to Diogenes, what's left is real freedom. In a society built on image, ancient Athens or Instagram, his rejection of appearances hits harder than ever. He didn't just question authority or wealth. He questioned the need for them. That's why so many thinkers, from Stoics to anarchists to comedians, have drawn inspiration from him. He's the original minimalist, the spiritual grandfather of every "I quit my six-figure job to live in a van" story you see online. Even Diogenes' crudeness has a place. He used shock not to offend, but to expose. He wanted people to feel the discomfort, because that's where reflection starts. If you're more disturbed by someone relieving themselves in public than you are by corruption in government or greed in religion, then Diogenes would say your priorities are upside down. And while his methods were unconventional, the core message is timeless. Virtue is not something you buy, brand, or broadcast. It's how you live when no one's watching. Or, in Diogenes' case, when literally everyone is watching and you just don't care. He reminds us that wisdom doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it shouts from a jar, laughs in your face, and refuses to move out of the sunlight. In a world overflowing with noise, branding, and nonsense, Diogenes invites us to be something different, honest, unfiltered, and just a little bit dog-like. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes him the wisest lunatic who ever lived. By the early 1870s, the northern plains were seething with tension, a slow, grinding build-up of broken promises, land theft, and cultural collision. At the heart of it was the Black Hills, a region sacred to the Lakota Sioux, who called it Paha Sapa. The US government had recognized this territory as belonging to the Lakota in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. On paper, the land was theirs forever, but forever, in this case, lasted about 6 years. Everything changed in 1874, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills by an expedition led by none other than George Armstrong Custer. Word got out, and like flies to honey, thousands of prospectors poured into the region, violating the treaty and desecrating sacred ground. The government, rather than enforce its own agreement, tried to buy the land from the Lakota. They refused. This wasn't just about gold. It was about survival, sovereignty, and the erosion of their way of life. To Washington, the Lakota and their allies were now hostiles. They weren't negotiating. They were resisting. The US Army was ordered to bring all native groups onto reservations by January 31st, 1876. Any group that didn't comply would be treated as enemies. Many didn't even receive the message, scattered as they were across vast winter hunting grounds. Others simply refused. They had no intention of abandoning their freedom for a life of dependence and confinement. What was forming on the plains wasn't just a disagreement, it was a collision course. A loose alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by legendary figures like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, began to gather. They were not a formal army, but they were bound by purpose, to protect their land, their people, and their way of life. They knew war was coming. Meanwhile, US military planners, confident in their numbers and technology, saw the tribes as disorganized and divided. They couldn't have been more wrong. The Plains warriors were highly mobile, intimately familiar with the terrain, and motivated by the deepest of causes. The powder keg was lit, the fuse was burning, and soon the clash that would become the Battle of Little Bighorn was hurtling toward history. George Armstrong Custer was not your average military officer. By 1876, he was a household name, a flamboyant, divisive Civil War hero with a reputation for boldness, recklessness, and a dangerous addiction to glory. with his flowing blonde hair, flashy uniforms, and appetite for headlines, Custer seemed more suited to a stage than a battlefield. And yet, his daring had earned him both respect and resentment. After the Civil War, Custer had been assigned to the western frontier as a lieutenant colonel in the 7th U.S. Cavalry. His job, enforce federal Indian policy, which increasingly meant forcing native tribes onto reservations, peacefully, if possible, violently, if necessary. By 1876, Custer was eager for a fight. His political ambitions were simmering, and a decisive military victory could restore his reputation after a public feud with President Ulysses S. Grant's administration. He wasn't just chasing Indians, he was chasing relevance. As tensions escalated with the Lakota and their allies, Custer was ordered to join a three-pronged campaign to locate and subdue the so-called hostiles. The plan was to encircle the native encampments and force them into submission. Custer's column would approach from the east, while General John Gibbon's troops came from the west and General George Crook's forces advanced from the south. But from the beginning, the plan suffered from overconfidence and poor coordination. The terrain was rugged, the distances vast, and the intelligence shaky at best. Most US officers, including Custer, believed they were facing a small, scattered group of warriors. They had no idea that thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had come together for a summer gathering near the Little Bighorn River, the largest native force ever assembled on the plains. Custer, as usual, wanted to strike quickly and claim the glory for himself. He declined reinforcements, refused to bring Gatling guns that would slow him down, and ignored orders to wait. Instead, he pushed ahead with his 600 men, splitting his forces into 3 battalions for a surprise attack. It was audacious, bold, and catastrophically misinformed, because what lay ahead was not a broken village of stragglers. It was a unified, battle-hardened force ready to defend its way of life. And Custer, with his signature flair, was about to ride straight into legend and disaster. While the US Army operated on faulty maps and faulty assumptions, something extraordinary was happening along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Thousands of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho had gathered, not for war initially, but for a traditional summer encampment. It was a time to rest, to hunt, to hold ceremonies, and to be together as families and allies. But the political reality of 1876 cast a long shadow over the gathering. The native leaders knew what was coming. They had seen the treaties broken, the buffalo herds disappear, and the encroachment of railroads and settlers. They understood that this encampment, peaceful as it seemed, might soon become a battlefield, and they weren't going to run. At the center of this growing coalition was Sitting Bull, a hunk-papa Lakota holy man and visionary leader. In the weeks leading up to the battle, he performed a powerful sun dance, a grueling ceremony of sacrifice and prayer. According to witnesses, Sitting Bull had a vision during the dance. He saw soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers, defeated and broken. For his followers, this was no metaphor. It was prophecy. And then there was Crazy Horse, a warrior of almost mythical skill and bravery. Quiet, reclusive, and deeply committed to protecting his people, Crazy Horse had already earned a reputation as a fearless leader in earlier battles. He would soon prove himself again, charging directly into enemy lines with a blend of daring and tactical brilliance. Other leaders, like Gall and Two Moons, also emerged as key voices. Though the tribes did not operate under a single centralized command, their unity in this moment was remarkable. They were defending more than land. They were defending freedom itself. Estimates vary, but there may have been 8,000 to 10,000 native people in the Little Bighorn Valley, including 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. They were well armed, many with repeating rifles and superior knowledge of the terrain, and most importantly, they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. Custer had expected a few hundred desperate warriors. Instead, he was about to face a formidable coalition, one born not just of resistance, but of spiritual resolve, ancestral duty, and the fierce will to survive. The storm was gathering. On June 22, 1876, Custer and his 7th Cavalry left the mouth of the Rosebud River, following tracks believed to lead to a nearby native encampment. For 3 days, they moved fast, too fast, pushing men and horses to exhaustion. Custer was convinced the native village would scatter if they realized soldiers were coming. He wanted to strike first, strike hard, and claim the glory before General Terry or Gibbon could arrive and steal the spotlight. But this urgency blinded him to caution. Scouts, including famed Crow and Arikara warriors, warned Custer that the village ahead was massive, unlike anything they had seen before. Some even climbed high ridges and returned with wide eyes, saying, "Too many to count." They urged Custer to wait, to reconsider. He did not. On the morning of June 25th, Custer reached a ridge overlooking the little Bighorn Valley. From a distance, he could see parts of the great encampment, teepees stretching along the river like a small city. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played. Horses grazed. But what he saw as a vulnerable camp was in fact a sleeping giant. Still believing he could surprise them, Custer made the fateful decision to divide his 600-man regiment. He sent Captain Frederick Benteen to scout to the south with 125 men. Major Marcus Reno was ordered to attack the southern end of the village with 140 men. Meanwhile, Custer himself took about 210 men northward, hoping to flank the village from behind and trap the warriors in a pincer move. It was bold, it was risky, and it was based on disastrously false assumptions. Custer did not know that the warriors were already aware of the soldiers' approach. Lakota scouts had spotted dust trails and moving columns. The element of surprise was lost before it ever began. As Reno's men descended into the valley, they didn't find panicked families running. They found warriors assembling, more warriors than they'd ever imagined, and instead of folding, the camp erupted into organized resistance, led by the very people Custer had underestimated. At that moment, the myth of invincibility surrounding the U.S. Army began to crack. The 7th Cavalry was walking into a storm it couldn't outrun, and Custer was leading the charge straight into its heart. At around 3 p.m. on June 25th, 1876, Major Marcus Reno and his men charged the southern end of the native encampment. What they expected was panic. Women and children fleeing, warriors scrambling. What they got instead was an organized, furious resistance. Within minutes, the charge unraveled. Reno's men dismounted in the timber along the river and opened fire. But the volume of returning fire shocked them. The warriors were not only numerous, they were aggressive, fast, and coordinated. Lakota and Cheyenne fighters surged across the open ground with terrifying speed, many on horseback, firing with deadly accuracy. Some carried Winchesters and Spencer repeating rifles, more advanced than the single-shot carbines the cavalry used. Reno panicked. Instead of holding his position, he gave a chaotic order to mount and retreat across the river. In the scramble, many soldiers were shot down, some drowned. The retreat turned into a rout. Bloodied and disorganized, Reno's men staggered up a bluff on the east side of the river, desperately trying to form a defensive position. Just then, Captain Frederick Benteen arrived from the south with reinforcements. Together, he and Reno established a rough perimeter atop what would later be called Reno Hill. There they dug in, low on water, surrounded and under constant fire. They could hear distant gunfire to the north, the sound of Custer's own fate unfolding, but they didn't know exactly what was happening. They sent messengers, but none returned. Meanwhile, in the valley below, native warriors swarmed across the battlefield, emboldened by Reno's retreat. Spirits rose. The prophecy was coming true. The invaders were not invincible. They were fleeing, and more were coming. Up until now, US military campaigns on the plains had been predictable. Native groups had learned to expect overwhelming force, fast strikes, and harsh retaliation. But this was different. The warriors were fighting on their own terms, mobile, determined, fueled by vision and rage. and while Reno clung to life on the hilltop, unsure of what had gone wrong, Custer was continuing his advance to the north, unaware that the entire tactical framework he relied on had already collapsed. The battle was no longer about strategy. It had become survival. And Custer's clock was ticking. While Reno's forces were retreating in chaos and Benteen was fortifying Reno Hill, Custer and his 210 men pressed northward, entirely unaware of the scale of the battle unfolding behind them. Still under the illusion that the village could be attacked from multiple directions, Custer's detachment moved along high ground, hoping to strike the village's rear. But the warriors knew he was coming. By now, the alarm had fully spread through the massive encampment. Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, hundreds strong, surged toward Custer's column. Instead of finding women and children to capture, Custer found himself facing a tidal wave of mounted fighters. His troops were stretched thin along the ridgelines and hills, trying to hold defensive positions, but they were quickly surrounded. The precise sequence of the fight remains debated. There were no survivors from Custer's immediate command. But what is clear is that the 7th Cavalry was overwhelmed in a matter of hours. The native forces, led by warriors like Crazy Horse and Gall, outmaneuvered and outnumbered Custer's men. Their superior knowledge of the terrain and aggressive tactics shredded the cavalry's lines. The soldiers tried to make a stand on what would later be called Last Stand Hill. Surrounded, out of ammunition, and with no escape, they fell. Some in small groups, some alone, some reportedly trying to shoot themselves rather than be captured. Native accounts described the battle as brutal and fast. It wasn't just a fight, it was a collapse. Custer was killed in the final moments, likely shot through the chest and head. He was found among a cluster of men, including his brothers Tom and Boston Custer. Nearly every soldier in his command was killed. Over 200 men, wiped out to the last. For the native warriors, it was a staggering and emotional victory. But it wasn't celebrated with triumphalism. Some accounts describe mourning rather than cheering, an understanding that while they had won the battle, war was far from over. The US Army would return, and this moment of glory would be met with vengeance. Still, for one day, on the rolling hills of Montana, the unstoppable machine of westward expansion had faltered, and Custer, the bold commander chasing legacy, had found it, not in conquest, but in annihilation. When the dust finally settled on the evening of June 25th, silence returned to the hills of the Little Bighorn. Fires smouldered, ammunition belts lay scattered, and over 200 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry lay dead, including George Armstrong Custer and nearly every officer under his direct command. The battlefield was littered with broken weapons, fallen horses, and the bodies of men who had never seen it coming. But the native victory, as complete as it was, came with a grim understanding. This was not the end. It was a spark. The US government, humiliated and enraged, would not forgive what they would call a massacre. Back east, newspapers screamed headlines of Custer's last stand, casting him as a martyr, and the native warriors as bloodthirsty aggressors. The context, the treaty violations, the gold rush into sacred lands, the defensive nature of the fight, was conveniently erased from the national narrative. In the days that followed, native families mourned their own losses. Though victorious, they had suffered casualties too, and they knew the American response would be swift. Some leaders, including Sitting Bull, urged the people to move quickly. They dismantled the great encampment and scattered into smaller bands across the plains, preparing for the retaliation they knew was coming. It wasn't long before US troops, reinforced and rearmed, descended on the region. The defeat at Little Bighorn only hardened Washington's resolve. Policies became harsher. Treaties were torn apart. More troops arrived. The goal was no longer negotiation, it was domination. Sitting Bull eventually fled north to Canada to avoid capture, while Crazy Horse continued to fight for another year before being killed under suspicious circumstances in 1877. Many bands, starved and outgunned, were forced onto reservations, their freedom shattered. The battlefield itself was discovered by relief troops 2 days later. The scene they found was grim and haunting. Many soldiers had been stripped of their uniforms and equipment, a traditional warrior custom meant to deprive enemies of dignity. Some bodies were mutilated, others left untouched, depending on tribal customs and the intensity of the fighting. But no one could deny what had happened. Custer was gone. The 7th Cavalry was decimated. And for a fleeting moment, native resistance had achieved the impossible. They had won. The Battle of Little Bighorn was more than just a military clash. It became a symbol, warped and weaponized by history. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it was a rare and hard-won victory against overwhelming odds. For the US government and its citizens, it was a humiliation that demanded swift, merciless retribution. In the American imagination, the narrative was quickly twisted. Custer was transformed from a reckless glory chaser into a tragic hero, the valiant general who made a last stand. The complexity of his decisions, the arrogance of his tactics, and the injustice of the US invasion into treaty-protected lands were all swept under a wave of patriotic mythology. The press labelled the native victory a massacre, erasing the fact that it was a defensive battle on native land. But among native communities, the battle was remembered very differently. It was a moment of unity, bravery, and prophecy fulfilled. The great encampment at the Little Bighorn represented a final shining moment of freedom, before the long shadow of reservation life closed in. For many, the battle became a point of pride, a testament to resistance and resilience. It proved that the indigenous peoples of the plains were not passive victims, but active defenders of their world. Yet the cost of that victory came swiftly. Within months, military campaigns intensified. The buffalo herds, already devastated, were targeted deliberately to destroy the native food supply. Tribes were relentlessly pursued. By 1877, Crazy Horse was dead. Sitting Bull would survive longer, but even he would eventually be killed in 1890, days before the Wounded Knee Massacre, another tragic milestone in the erasure of native sovereignty. And so, the legacy of Little Bighorn became twofold, a source of inspiration and mourning. It exposed the cruelty of US expansion, the broken promises, and the ferocity of a people who refused to be erased quietly. Today, the battlefield stands as a national memorial. For years, it honoured only Custer and his men. But more recently, memorials have been added to honour the native warriors who fought and died there. Not as villains, but as heroes defending their homelands. The hills remember both sides. The wind carries both songs. And the legacy of Little Bighorn still speaks, if you're willing to listen to more than one version of history. In the grand arc of American history, the Battle of Little Bighorn stands out as one of those rare moments when the underdog didn't just fight back, they won. For a single day in 1876, native warriors held back the tide of an empire. They didn't win by numbers, technology, or wealth. They won with courage, unity, and an unshakable will to protect their way of life. But the tragedy of Little Bighorn is that this victory did not change the outcome of history. It only delayed it. In fact, it accelerated the end. The stunning defeat of Custer enraged Washington. Public opinion hardened. Sympathy for native grievances, where it had existed, was buried under waves of vengeance and nationalism. Congress increased military funding. The campaign against the Plains tribes intensified with brutal precision. Within just a few years, the nomadic life that had defined Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho culture for centuries was gone. The buffalo were nearly extinct, the reservations carved up, the land parcelled out. The very hills that had once echoed with hooves and war cries now stood silent. And yet, Little Bighorn refused to fade. Over the decades, it has been reinterpreted, reimagined, and reclaimed. For many Americans, it started as a tale of heroic sacrifice. For others, it gradually became a symbol of injustice, of a nation that broke its word and called resistance treason. Today, the site is one of the few battlefields where both sides are remembered. where the markers don't all point in one direction. For native peoples, the battle remains deeply symbolic, not as the beginning of defeat, but as the final brilliant stand of a free people. A moment when everything that was being taken from them, land, freedom, dignity, was fought for with every ounce of spirit they had left. It was, and still is, a sacred memory. And for the rest of us, Little Bighorn offers a difficult but necessary lesson about power, about myth, about the cost of conquest. It reminds us that history is not always told by the victors. Sometimes it's buried beneath them, waiting to be unearthed. In the end, Custer may have gotten the glory, but the warriors of Little Bighorn got something far more lasting: the truth and the right to say, "We were here, and we fought." The Forbidden City wasn't just built. It was conjured into existence with ambition, labour, and a deep desire for control. In 1406, the Yongle Emperor of the Ming dynasty ordered the construction of a new imperial palace in Beijing, aiming to move the capital from Nanjing. But this wasn't going to be any ordinary palace. It would become the heart of the Chinese Empire, a fortified city within a city, where no one entered unless summoned, and no secrets left its walls unfiltered. Over the next 14 years, more than 1 million labourers, craftsmen, and engineers worked to complete this enormous undertaking. The materials alone were drawn from every corner of the empire: golden Nanmu wood from Sichuan, giant marble blocks hauled across frozen rivers, and millions of glazed roof tiles baked to perfection. Brick by brick, an empire's pride was set in stone. When finished, the Forbidden City covered nearly 180 acres and housed over 900 buildings. Its layout followed strict Confucian principles: symmetrical, orderly, hierarchical. At its core lay the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors were crowned and decrees thundered through the bureaucracy. But beyond the grandeur, the deeper purpose was psychological. This wasn't just a residence, it was a statement. The emperor does not live among you, he lives above you. And make no mistake, it was truly forbidden. The average citizen of Beijing never stepped foot inside. Even high officials entered only by imperial permission. Guards stood at every gate. Spies lurked in every corridor. The outer city bustled with markets and common life, but inside the red walls, time slowed and ceremony ruled. It was a world locked in ritual, cloaked in mystery, and insulated from the messiness of daily life. But beneath its golden rooftops and crimson columns, the Forbidden City was also a pressure cooker. For all its beauty, it was built to isolate, to keep power centralized, to shield the emperor from threats both physical and political. In time, it would become a place of intrigue, betrayal, and whispers in the shadows. A palace? Yes. But also a stage, for 5 centuries of empire, ambition, and slow unravelling. From the outside, it dazzled. From the inside, it watched, and it never ever forgot who walked its halls. At the heart of the Forbidden City sat the Emperor, the Son of Heaven, the living bridge between the mortal realm and the divine. But for all his cosmic authority, the man on the throne often led a life of extraordinary isolation. The Forbidden City didn't just protect the Emperor, it consumed him. Every day of his life was scripted with suffocating precision. He awoke to music, was dressed by attendants, and followed a schedule so ritualized it bordered on theatrical. Meals were sampled for poison. Documents were read aloud by ministers kneeling before him. Even a stroll through the gardens required ceremonial clearance and multiple escorts. Nothing was spontaneous. Everything was watched. And while the emperor sat at the top of the hierarchy, he was far from free. The very structure that elevated him also imprisoned him. Surrounded by layers of eunuchs, ministers, consorts, and spies, the emperor rarely encountered the outside world. His information was filtered, his interactions managed, and his ability to act independently, especially in later dynasties, was often stifled by the overwhelming machinery of court protocol. Some emperors handled this with ruthless efficiency, like Yongle or Kangxi, who ruled with a firm hand and mastered the bureaucracy. Others fell into paranoia, decadence, or detachment, lost in their own palace like a gilded ghost. There were emperors who spent months, even years, within the forbidden city without setting foot outside the walls. The world they ruled might as well have been on the moon. Even within the palace, access to the emperor was tightly controlled. High-ranking officials could wait days for an audience. Family members had limited contact, and heaven help the servant who crossed the wrong threshold. Protocol dictated where you could stand, how you bowed, and even what you were allowed to see. In theory, the emperor could command legions with a word. In practice, he often struggled to know who to trust or what was really happening beyond his walls. The throne might have been carved from jade and set above dragons, but it was also surrounded by curtains, layers upon layers of secrecy and ceremony. The forbidden city crowned its emperor in gold, but it also wrapped him in silence. Behind every throne in the forbidden city stood an invisible army, not of generals or ministers, but eunuchs. Castrated men who served within the palace, eunuchs began as humble servants, but evolved into some of the most powerful and feared figures in imperial China. In a world where women were cloistered and men were threats, eunuchs occupied a strange middle space, intimate with the emperor, yet politically useful because they could never father rival dynasties. At first, their duties were simple: managing palace chores, delivering messages, caring for imperial robes. But as the emperors became more secluded, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties, eunuchs began to fill the vacuum. They controlled access to the emperor, filtered information, and eventually took over administrative functions entirely. Some wielded more power than generals. Others had the emperor's ear in ways even his own family didn't. And with power came ambition and corruption. The history of eunuchs in the Forbidden City is a cycle of rise and ruin. For every loyal servant, there was a schemer manipulating imperial decisions, silencing opponents, and hoarding wealth. Some eunuchs, like Wei Zhongxian during the late Ming period, effectively ran the empire from behind silk screens. His enemies disappeared, his allies were promoted, and entire ministries lived in fear of his whispers. But the influence of eunuchs wasn't just political. It was personal. They cared for the emperor since childhood, watched him grow, and often became surrogate fathers, mentors, or enablers. Their presence was constant, in the emperor's chambers, his study, his court. If the emperor was lonely, it was often the eunuchs who knew, and sometimes exploited, that loneliness. Yet their lives were far from luxurious. Many were forcibly castrated as boys, often from poor families hoping to secure them a future inside the palace. Those who survived the brutal operation and years of menial work could, with cunning and luck, rise in rank. But they were always viewed with suspicion by Confucian scholars and military elites, tolerated, used, and eventually scapegoated when things went wrong. In a city built on ceremony and secrecy, the eunuchs were the silent hands that moved the pieces. Not kings, not pawns, but something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Beyond the grand halls and towering gates of the Forbidden City lay its most secretive zone, the inner court. This was the emperor's private world, a maze of palaces, gardens, and sleeping chambers hidden deep behind the red walls. Here, the business of state gave way to the business of dynasty, consorts, concubines, and children. And here, politics took on a new, more intimate form, one where beauty, jealousy, and bloodlines ruled the game. The inner court was divided into 3 main palaces for the emperor's use, and 6 residences for the empress and concubines. But don't be fooled by the serene names and fragrant gardens. This was not a peaceful retreat. It was a battlefield, with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women competing for favour. The inner court was a world of veiled threats, whispered alliances, and calculated ambition. At the top stood the empress, the legal wife of the emperor. She held rank and ceremony, but not always his affection. The emperor's heart and heirs often came from the concubines, whose status could rise or fall overnight depending on a glance, a pregnancy, or a single rumour. Some bore sons and were elevated to power. Others faded into obscurity, their names forgotten, their futures quietly erased. Palace maids and senior eunuchs acted as intermediaries, messengers, and, occasionally, spies. Nothing happened without being seen. Nothing was forgotten. The women of the court had little freedom, but they wielded influence in subtler ways, through charm, manipulation, and sometimes poison. Occasionally, a consort would gain such favour that she effectively ruled through the emperor. One of the most famous was Empress Dowager Cixi, who rose from low-ranking concubine to virtual ruler of China for nearly half a century. Her power began inside these very walls, behind closed doors, in silken robes, with a brilliant mind cloaked in patience. To outsiders, the inner court was silent and perfumed, a place of art, music, and refinement. But behind the latticed windows and painted screens, it was a pressure chamber where status, survival, and lineage collided. In the Forbidden City, power did not only march in boots and robes. Sometimes it tiptoed through moonlit corridors in embroidered slippers, smiling sweetly, waiting to strike. Inside the Forbidden City, every gesture had meaning. Every step, every bow, every incense offering. Nothing was done casually. This wasn't just a palace. It was a divine machine. And the emperor wasn't just a man. He was the son of heaven, the bridge between the earthly and the celestial. That meant every movement he made had cosmic weight. It wasn't just about power. It was about order. Each morning, officials lined up at the Meridian Gate long before sunrise, waiting for the morning court audience. These sessions were brief and highly choreographed. Ministers kneeled, spoke only when spoken to, and delivered their memorials with a practiced humility. Outside the palace, they were powerful men. Inside, they were shadows at the emperor's feet. One of the grandest rituals was the winter solstice ceremony, where the emperor offered sacrifices at the Temple of Heaven to ensure harmony between heaven and earth. These rituals weren't optional. They were political theatre on a sacred scale. A failed ritual, bad weather, a forgotten step, was seen as a sign that the mandate of heaven might be weakening. Inside the palace, rituals governed every aspect of life: weddings, funerals, births, even meals. The emperor's food was inspected by multiple officials, tasted for poison, and arranged according to strict traditions. If the emperor changed the menu without permission, chaos could ripple through the kitchens and court alike. But perhaps the most telling ritual was silence. You didn't speak to the emperor unless spoken to. You didn't look him in the eye. Even his family bowed, rose, and retreated backwards. Distance was mandatory. Intimacy was rare. Over time, the obsession with ritual became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it preserved continuity, structure, and legitimacy across centuries. On the other, it paralyzed decision-making. Ministers debated protocol while the world outside changed. Foreign powers advanced. Revolution stirred. But inside the Forbidden City, the officials were still arguing about the proper number of ceremonial steps for a royal procession. The rituals that once cemented power began to calcify it. They kept the empire spinning, but also stuck in place, like a beautifully painted clock whose hands no longer moved. Inside those golden walls, the performance continued, flawless, precise, and increasingly irrelevant. Beneath the lacquered beams and golden tiles of the Forbidden City lay a world not seen in paintings, a world of shadows, whispers, and endless suspicion. Though the walls kept enemies out, they couldn't keep ambition in. And in a palace where power was concentrated, inherited, and often unstable, the greatest dangers weren't armies at the gates. They were servants in your chamber. Spying was not just common, it was institutionalized. Eunuchs reported to other eunuchs. Palace maids gossiped in coded whispers. Even concubines had informants bribing or blackmailing lower servants for information about their rivals. The emperor's word was law, but most of the time, he didn't know which words to trust. Paranoia was routine. Letters were opened. Conversations were overheard. An offhand remark could be twisted into treason. False accusations flourished. Ministers might rise to glory one day and be exiled the next based on a whisper. Families disappeared overnight. Some chose suicide over trial, understanding the fate that awaited them if they resisted. The eunuchs were both participants and enforcers of this invisible war. While some were loyal and protective of the emperor, others built spy networks that rivaled secret police. Under the Ming dynasty, the infamous Eastern Depot, a eunuch-run intelligence agency, was given terrifying power: the ability to arrest, interrogate and execute without consulting the civil government. Torture was standard. Confessions were extracted like teeth. And while court scholars and officials resented the eunuch's influence, they weren't above intrigue themselves. The court was a chessboard, and every promotion, every marriage alliance, every imperial edict was a move in an endless game. At times, even the emperor was a pawn, especially if he was young, sickly, or uninterested in ruling. Regents and dowagers pulled the strings, smiling in daylight and striking by night. It was a world where success demanded silence, cunning, and an impeccable memory for allegiances. One misstep, even an unguarded look, could be fatal. And yet, people schemed on. Because in the Forbidden City, there was no higher prize than proximity to the throne, and no deeper fall than losing it. Beneath the rituals and red walls was a city that never truly slept, only watched and waited. The Forbidden City may have looked eternal, its golden roofs glowing in the sun, its red walls unshaken by time, but inside, dynasties rose and crumbled with alarming frequency. Power that appeared divine from a distance often turned out to be dangerously mortal up close. And sometimes, the empire didn't fall on a battlefield. It fell in a quiet corridor, behind a locked door, whispered out of existence by those closest to the throne. The Ming dynasty, which built the Forbidden City, ruled for nearly 3 centuries. But by the 1600s, it was staggering under the weight of its own bureaucracy, internal corruption, and peasant uprisings. The palace had become a maze of ceremonial obsessions and eunuch dominance, while famine and unrest brewed outside. In 1644, as rebel armies closed in on Beijing, the last Ming emperor hanged himself in the palace gardens. He left behind a note lamenting his failure, and a palace ripe for takeover. The Manchus, a foreign power from the northeast, swept in and established the Qing dynasty. Remarkably, they chose to keep the Forbidden City as their seat of power, adapting its traditions while inserting their own. The architecture remained, but the language, dress, and rituals evolved. Once again, red walls absorbed the shock of transition and kept the illusion of continuity alive. The Qing ruled from the Forbidden City for another 268 years, through high points of prosperity and devastating collapse. The late Qing emperors, especially during the 19th century, struggled to adapt to modern pressures: Western imperialism, internal rebellions, and technological stagnation. Meanwhile, Empress Dowager Cixi ruled from behind a curtain, literally manipulating court politics while refusing reforms that might have saved the empire. By the time the boy Emperor Puyi ascended the throne in 1908, the Forbidden City was more museum than power centre. In 1912, the Qing dynasty fell, and with it over 2 millennia of imperial rule. But oddly, Puyi was allowed to remain inside the Forbidden City for another 13 years, like a ghost wandering the ruins of his own past. The emperors were gone, but the city remained, hollowed out, majestic, and haunted by the echoes of vanished dynasties. The walls had survived, but the thrones within them had not. After the Qing dynasty fell in 1912, the Forbidden City should have gone silent. But instead, it entered one of the strangest chapters in its 5-century history. The monarchy was gone. China was now a republic. And yet, inside the crimson walls, a child emperor remained. Puyi, age 6, still dressed in dragon robes, still bowing to empty rituals, and still ruling over nothing. This bizarre arrangement was the result of a political compromise. The new Republican government allowed Puyi to remain in the inner court of the Forbidden City, cut off from Beijing's changing streets. Outside, warlords battled for power, and revolution reshaped society. Inside, time stood still. Eunuchs continued their duties. Meals were served in ceremonial fashion. The emperor woke, dressed, and was bowed to, a monarch without a monarchy, a boy living inside a dream already shattered. But Puyi wasn't blind. As he grew older, he began to question the world around him. He read newspapers smuggled into the palace. He saw airplanes fly overhead. Modernity buzzed outside his gates, while he lived in a museum of fading grandeur. And he knew, even if no one said it aloud, that the empire was truly gone. His isolation bred resentment, curiosity, and eventually defiance. In 1923, a massive fire broke out in the palace, a suspicious blaze that destroyed precious treasures. Puyi accused the eunuchs of theft and sabotage, and in response, he expelled hundreds of them. Centuries of palace tradition vanished overnight. The Forbidden City was emptying out. By 1924, a warlord named Feng Yuxiang finally expelled Puyi from the palace altogether. The emperor, now a young man, was escorted out through the same gates emperors had ruled from for generations. He was carried in a rickshaw, no throne, no honor guard, just a displaced figure wrapped in the memory of vanished power. But Puyi's story didn't end there. He would later collaborate with the Japanese, become a puppet ruler in Manchuria, and eventually be captured, imprisoned and re-educated by the communist regime. In his final years, he worked as a gardener, tending flowers in Beijing, living quietly not far from the palace that once defined him. Puyi was the last to live in the Forbidden City, and when he left, he took the empire's final breath with him. Today, the Forbidden City no longer hides secrets, it displays them. What was once off-limits to nearly all of China is now open to millions. Renamed the Palace Museum, it stands as a monument not just to imperial grandeur, but to the complicated layers of history, power, and identity that shaped a civilization. Walking through its gates today, visitors pass under the same towering red walls that once intimidated diplomats and echoed with the footsteps of eunuchs. The golden roofs still gleam in the sunlight, and the dragon motifs remain as fierce as ever. But now, instead of guards and courtiers, you'll find tour guides, selfie sticks, and schoolchildren with notebooks. The Forbidden City houses more than 1.8 million artifacts, scrolls, paintings, porcelain, ceremonial garments, weapons, and personal belongings of emperors and empresses. But beyond the objects, what lingers most is the silence of rooms that once dictated the fate of millions. Empty thrones, closed doors, and vast courtyards whisper stories more powerful than any exhibit label. Restoration efforts have kept the complex remarkably intact, and yet the Forbidden City is more than preserved. It has been transformed. It's a living museum, a national symbol, and paradoxically, a place where the memory of autocracy now serves public education. The irony isn't lost. A palace built to exclude has become one of the most visited places on Earth. Still, beneath the tourist chatter and camera flashes, the deeper weight of the site persists. You feel it in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors once stood above a kneeling court. You feel it in the shaded corridors of the inner court, where whispers decided destinies. And you feel it in the gardens, where lonely rulers once wandered among rock sculptures, longing for a world they could barely touch. In many ways, the Forbidden City is China's mirror, a reflection of grandeur, control, vulnerability, and endurance. It's not just a relic of the past, it's a framework for understanding how history shapes the present. From isolation to revolution to public memory, it has seen every chapter, and it continues to watch. Not as a seat of power anymore, but as a witness to everything that followed after the empire's last breath.